desert remembers, even when people forget. And as the twin moons drift slowly across the sky, their light gathers over the dunes like soft silver dust. Tonight, dear traveler, before we step deeper into the worlds waiting for Aiden, before we follow the whispers that call his forgotten name through sand and starlight, I ask you to settle yourself once more. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders soften. Let the weight of the day spill gently away from you. We are returning to a story that stretches farther than memory. A story woven from fragments of a life Aiden once lived, and echoes from a past he has only begun to uncover. This is the chapter where the desert begins to speak, where the wind carries voices older than time, and where the world reveals pieces of a boy who was never just a wanderer, but someone meant for far greater things. So come closer, quiet your thoughts, and let your heart open to the calm. The desert is waiting, the stars are watching, and the next part of Aiden's journey is ready to unfold like a secret whispered beneath the sand. Tonight, traveler, we follow the echoes, whispers in the sand, Aiden's Chronicles, Volume 2. The desert held its breath, and Aiden walked on with slow, careful steps, letting the sand receive him as if it were glad to hold his footprints for a while. The pendant lay warm under his shirt, a small, steady ember against his chest, and each time it thumped, he felt like it released a little map of feeling into his bones. He moved without hurry, listening to the wind and the distant hum of the place where the city met the horizon. And in that listening, something loosened inside him. The whispers rode the air like a soft current, half music, half remembered language, and Aiden let them pass through him rather than trapping them in the nets of questions. The dunes curved around him like a slow, gentle tide, and the sky above was the slow kind of blue that takes forever to change. He felt held there, as if the world wanted him to notice the small things, the way a moth fluttered, the way a pebble broke the smooth line of a dune, the way a scrap of cloth flared, and then settled like a sigh. He found the basin again, where the sand carried marks of older hands and older minds, and the pattern he had seen once before shimmered faintly, as if a secret had been placed there for him alone. When he set his hand on the center, the ground warmed, as if remembering his palm, and he saw not an image, but a feeling like a doorway opening just a crack. He let himself rest in that crack for a long, slow breath, and in the space behind his eyes, a light glowed, a corridor of blue, a voice that hummed a name like a lullaby. It was enough to steady him. He rose and walked toward the ruin that jutted from the sand like an old ship, each step deliberate, each breath a soft metronome. The ruined spire was only half buried, and it kept its own hush, a private history wrapped in metal and etched lines that looked almost like constellations. Aiden pressed a palm to the cold and felt a response like a whisper of welcome, and that small stroke felt like a guarantee. You were meant here. Inside the hollow, the air lost its sharpness and hung like velvet, and the console in the center glowed with the ghost of a language he almost recognized. He placed his hand on the surface, and it brightened as if acknowledging an old friend. The voice played, not long, not loud, but it fit in the pit of his chest like a piece of puzzle finally clicked. "You were brought for safety," it said, "and when the stars are ready, you will remember more." The phrase was a soft key. For a while, he simply breathed that key and let whatever loosened settle. Outside, the light slid across the hollow, and in that motion, Aiden saw shadows that looked like faces, but were not, memories not quite formed into names. He left the place with the spire's small warmth in his pocket, and a quiet awe blooming that felt less like knowledge and more like permission to begin. He wandered toward places the map of his memory suggested without telling him why, passing broken glass that glittered like distant seas and metal ribs that had once been proud and were now gentle fossils. He found a shallow trench where the wind had not yet rewritten the shapes, and he sat there, letting the cool of the exposed earth breathe into him. He took the pendant in hand and turned it over slowly worn edges, faint scratches that might have been marks of play or marks of protection, and the weight of it reminded him of all the small things that hold time. A low sound moved under the dunes, the kind of subtone that suggested deep machines sleeping or old engines dreaming. Aiden breathed with that sound until it slowed and then settled, and when he rose, he felt something like resolve, not the forceful kind, but a quiet standing up of the spirit. If the world had left breadcrumbs for him to follow, he would follow them. If the world had left questions, he would learn to sit with them. That evening, the sky filled with thin clouds that the city lights painted in faint colors, and Aiden watched far-off silhouettes of skyways like veins of slow light. He walked back to the village under that spilled color and passed by people who moved in soft ways around their small lives, someone leaning on a crate and whittling, someone sweeping the dust carefully into neat piles. A boy smiled at Aiden and offered him a roasted fruit without words, and Aiden accepted it like a little promise of community. He sat a while and let the night speak itself into him through the simple kindnesses of others. And when sleep finally settled, he dreamed of a room where a hand folded cloth and hummed under its breath. The note of the hum stayed with him as he woke, and he knew the journey ahead felt steadier than it had before. The road out of the village felt different in morning light. The dunes wore the sun like a ribbon, and every grain seemed to hold its own small pulse of warmth. Aiden walked with the pendant heavy in his pocket, and a small map in his head made of sensations rather than words. The direction was not always forward. Sometimes it meant turning a little left or walking slow in a circle that felt like listening more than seeking. He moved past scattered flotsam of metal and glass and found a shallow hollow where an old caravan had once camped. In the hollow, the ground held marks of many feet, boot prints, wheel ruts, the vague compass of travel. Aiden knelt and traced them with his finger, feeling how the past could leave a print that was almost like an invitation. He let that sense sit with him like a warm stone. The wind brought voices that were not human sometimes. Electronic chirps from ruined nodes, soft pings of circuits, waking then sleeping again. And Aiden learned to listen with both ears equally, the one for words and the one for those other kinds of messages. He found a small device half buried with an engraved mother-of-pearl insert, and when he brushed away the sand, it sparked like a remembered star. He tucked it in his pocket like currency, and it hummed faintly in reply, as if happy to be found. When he reached the ridge overlooking a valley, the city lay as a shimmering stripe of wonder on the horizon, and Aiden felt the old, complex tug. Home, memory, curiosity. He sat and watched for a long time, letting the skyline become a part of his steadiness rather than an ache. He met travelers along the road. A woman who traded stories for jars of water, a mechanic who repaired toys, and promised to teach him how to coax life from machines. A quiet elder who spoke of a library that kept not only books, but the recorded echoes of events and voices. Aiden found that the more he listened, the more the world supplied its fragments gently. He traded small favors, helping mend nets, fetching a needed coil, and in return received maps scrawled on bits of paper or directions, passed like a recipe from hand to hand. He hoarded these like jewels, not because they were valuable, but because they made his map bigger and his direction clearer. At dusk, he found a small hollow where the stars seemed very near and built a tiny fire. The crackle of flame made all things feel ordinary and sacred at once. A wanderer sat with him, unassuming and careful, who had the kind of eyes that held 100 small tales. They shared silence for a while, and then the wanderer spoke of a place where objects kept memory, small devices designed long ago to remember for people who might forget. They called them keepers, the wanderer said, stirring the embers, and some thought them dangerous. Others thought them precious. They stored echoes and murmurs, recordings of ordinary days that ended up feeling like treasure. Aiden listened and let the words sink in, feeling, as always, the pendant's heat answering in small beats. In the morning they parted, and Aiden took the path that led through cracked metal fences toward a small cluster of ruins with a sign half-lettered, half-buried. The ruins smelled of oil and lemon and old pages, and he found inside a narrow room with shelves where small devices lay like sleeping birds. One of them, a round recorder with a small worn button, chimed when he touched it, and a voice wrapped him like a shawl. It sang a fragment of the lullaby he had been chasing for months, and for once the sound did not fade into a blur. Instead, It fit into him like a soft key and opened not a whole door, but a little shelf inside where he placed the image carefully. He left the ruins with a file on a tiny chip tucked into his jacket, and the feeling of progress that was gentle rather than euphoric. He followed the map of listening a little further that day and reached the edge of a place called the Glass Ravine, where panels of smoothed glass jutted from the sand like thin moons. There, a small repair shop rented a corner to people who fixed memory keepers and toys and old clocks. The repairer there, hair like silver wire and hands sure as old rope, smiled in a way that said he'd seen many seekers pass his bench. He coaxed open the recorder, cleaned contacts, and played a longer file that described a small house and a song about folded linen, the kind of ordinary details that suddenly seemed weighty and precious. Aiden felt the notes settle in his chest like a promise held in soft fingers. He tucked the recording into his boot and stepped back outside into an evening that kept him company like an old friend. Night fell soft as wool, and the moonlight laid a river of silver through the dunes leading back to his village. Aiden walked that river step by step, each motion a prayer in motion, and when he arrived, he was not the same as the one who had left. He carried new small pieces, chips of sound, an old pendant warm with meaning, and the patient knowledge that the world had more to give if he only kept asking quietly. He found the road kids again, where they shared food and laughter beside a low, sputtering lamp. And they welcomed him with the easy affection of those who live in half-shared families. He told them of the spire and the hiding room and the voice that had spoken in the dark. And they listened as if they were hearing a myth being lived rather than a rumor. A small boy in the circle reached out and touched the pendant, and then smiled with the simple belief that objects could be keys. Aiden smiled too, and felt the small community settle like a blanket around his shoulders. He slept that night under a tent roof dotted with holes where stars pried through, and dreamt of rooms he could not fully reach. The dreams were not violent or sharp, they were soft impressions. A table with cups, a lamp left on, a pair of shoes in the doorway, a door that opened to a sky that did not look like this world. He woke with that lingering warmth and decided the next sun would take him back to the city with a plan. The memory wing had given him a foothold, and the ruins had given him a compass. The city might hold records more complete than the scattered files he had gathered. And so it was that, with a small pack and a heart balanced between hope and patience, he set out once more. The road into the city felt longer this time, less because of distance, and more because he kept stopping to listen to the small worlds he passed. On a bridge of beaten metal, he met a woman who sold thin sheets of music she had written for memory keepers, and she offered him a scrap with notes that matched the melody he'd heard. He kept it folded in his shirt like a talisman. At the edge of the city, a low thunder came as vehicles shifted lanes above a lattice of sky roads, and the city's scent wrapped around him: fried bread, oil, lemon, and the crisp tang of ozone from archaic machines. He moved through the city like a pilgrim, giving himself permission to wander rather than to command, letting the city instruct him in its own method of slow revelation. In a narrow lane far from the main markets, he found a small shop that specialized in old memory keepers. The person behind the counter, a woman with quiet, exacting hands, examined his pendant like it was both an artifact and an address. She offered him tea and spoke in a way that suggested she kept both knowledge and patience. "Keepers remember what you forget," she said softly, pouring the tea. "They can be noisy with useless memory or tender with important ones, but they always need attention. Storage loves company." Aiden listened and asked questions, and learned that some keepers required ritualized warmings, small circuits of care that coaxed their recordings to the surface. He learned how to feed them juice of lemon and oil, and how to warm a chip in cupped hands to wake a sleeping memory. At dusk, she guided him to a back room and attached the pendant to a small reader. The pendant had never been used like that, and the device hummed with curiosity. A faint image appeared on a tiny display, shapes like rooms, a hand smoothing a cloth, a voice humming. For a few heartbeats, Aiden felt the image as if the screen were a window he could step through. Then the view shuttered, and the device quieted, as if the pendant had offered what it could and needed more rest. He left the shop with more to learn and a new method to try. Patience, warmth, careful repetition. He learned that memory is not a thing to be forced. It is a garden that grows when tended. Days folded into a rhythm as Aiden practiced the gentle tending of memory keepers. He visited the memory wing again and again, each time leaving with a small fragment and a fuller heart. One afternoon, he sat with an archivist who showed him how to align recordings with smells and textures, how the human brain accepted memory more readily when it could tie it to a sensory hook. They taught him a simple ritual: light a candle, breathe the scent, place the pendant in the warmth, and then listen. He did this under an open skylight that smelled of old paper and lemon. And as he breathed, he felt threads of memory rising like dust motes in slanting light. He closed his eyes and let them turn into a soft film. A hand smoothing a blanket, a child's laugh against a tiled floor, the shape of a room where walls were painted a gentle blue. One evening, a letter reached him, small, folded paper slipped under a tarp near the memory wing. It had no stamp and no signature, only a faint imprint of a symbol he knew well: the two moons and the star. His heart jumped. The letter read like a map written in a lullaby, 3 simple directions, an address of sorts, a neighborhood edge where shutters creaked at night, a stair that never faced the sun, a rooftop under which humming water could be heard. The handwriting was thin and careful, and though no name marked it, Aiden felt it as a hand reaching across time to place a bookmark at the exact line where he might pick up a story. He folded it into his pocket and felt a small, steady flame of courage. He followed the directions, as if following a breath, and found the stair with the wrong face. At the corner of the stair, tucked under a loose stone, a tiny box waited, no lock, simply a lid that opened like a knowing mouth. Inside lay a short spool of tape on an old reel, and when he wound the tape through the neighbor's player, a voice came through, a woman's voice this time, soft and careful. She spoke of looking for someone with a name like his, of keeping a watch when tides were uncertain, and of leaving small signs for a child who might walk into the dunes. The voice made him ache in a way that wasn't hurt, and it made him believe that someone had loved him enough to leave tracks to follow. He followed those tracks deeper into alleys that smelled like lemon oil and old rain, and the city began to feel less like a mass of strangers and more like a library of people who had quietly left gifts for those who would listen. In a tucked-away courtyard, he found an old man who repaired star charts and who remembered a small project by a forgotten lab that made memory devices for children. They used to build stories into them, he said, rubbing his hands, so a child could carry their home in a necklace or a toy. Aiden listened with a hunger tempered by care. He did not want to swallow the whole world at once. He wanted one piece at a time, each one soft and ready to be placed in the chest like a found shell. One night, he was led by a string of small hints to a small house behind a bakery. The door was cracked and warm with the smell of bread, and inside a room smelled of lavender and oil. On a shelf lay a small book tied with linen and a note that simply read, "For the one who remembers later." Aiden opened the book and found a child's sketch of a sky with 2 moons and a tiny house drawn under them. There were scribbled notes in a sure hand, recipes for making lemon oil, a lullaby, and finally, a tiny photograph stuck to the page blurry, but unmistakably, a hand holding a pendant over a small lamp. He ran his finger across the photograph and felt a sound like a bell ring small and clear inside his chest. Pieces were being given to him as gently as someone would hand a lost child a blanket, with a map slowly sewn from threads of sound, scent, and fragile paper. Aiden began to see connections he had not seen before the memory wing, and the ruins and pockets of kindness in the city were all nodes of a web that had been left intact for those who might one day return. He learned that memory could be coaxed with scent, with warmth, with the rhythm of a repeated sound. He learned to listen to the way the city sighed at dawn, and how a particular clatter under one vendor's stall sounded exactly like the rhythm of a lullaby. He practiced day after day, becoming patient and gentle with the devices, and with himself, as though he were learning to grow a garden in a land that had once forgotten how to reign. One morning, while repairing a small recorder, the device gave a sequence of sounds that fit a pattern he had been hearing for weeks. It repeated the cadence 3 times, and then a single clear word sliced through the loop, home. It sank into him like a pebble sinking into water, and concentric rings of feeling spread, until he could not tell if it was the recorder or the world telling him. But he did not need to know which. He walked to the edge of the city that afternoon, along a low concrete sea wall where the lights reflected like memory. He sat and listened to the city as if it were telling a long, patient story only he could understand. The sky opened, and the 2 moons began to lift in a slow arc like a page turning. He decided to return to the ruins one last time before he planned his next move. The desert met him as an old friend, and the wind gathered his footprints into neat, slow arches that looked like calligraphy. At the ruins' entrance, the metal glinted faintly, and the console hummed like the voice of an old friend waking. He pressed his palm to the console, and it answered with a new message, a longer fragment than before, speech mixed with music, an old lullaby sung by a voice that knew him intimately, and spoke of a place with windows and blue paint and baked bread. It ended with a single instruction that felt more like a promise than an order. Follow the river of sky. He did not know what a river of sky meant exactly, but that night he lay on a dune and watched the sky rails make slow white paths across the heavens, streams of light where vehicles drifted like fish in slow ponds. He imagined the rails like veins and thought of the city as a body, and imagined that somewhere along those veins the hidden home might be waiting. He closed his eyes and allowed the dream of following a line of light to settle, and when he woke in the soft morning, he felt the plot take shape in his mind. The river of sky would be his next thread. Aiden followed vague clues through days that felt like pages of a book, read aloud at a low voice, moving through neighborhoods with names that rolled like songs and alleys that smelled of lemon and bread. He crossed a bridge where a vendor played a tin flute with a simple repeating melody that matched a rhythm that had haunted him for weeks. He followed the tune and found himself standing at the edge of an old transit hub where sky rails intersected like slow woven threads. The place was quiet and mostly unused, an old node where people once rode to other districts with soft wicker baskets and small, careful luggage. Now it had become a place for lost objects and forgotten signs, and tucked into one corner was a faded poster announcing a children's program that had closed decades ago. He climbed the stairs of the old station with the pendant heavy in his pocket, and his heart light with both hope and weary patience. At the top, he found a long corridor lined with bulletin boards full of notices. One of them had a small, folded piece of paper stuck beneath a rusted tack. He pulled it free and recognized the handwriting of the note he had found earlier, the same thin, careful script, and the familiar symbol of 2 moons and a star. It read simply, "Under the 3rd rail, a door opens for those who listen." He followed the stair down to the underpass, and there, low in the shadow of a forgotten platform, a narrow hatch waited, its handle worn soft by hands long gone. The hatch dropped into a small chamber designed for children once, with murals of stars on the wall and shelves, just low enough to be reached by little hands. In the center sat a small wooden box covered in fabric. Inside the box lay a small book with a blue cloth cover, and a token 2 moons and a star carved into a tiny disc. When Aiden touched the disc, the air seemed to rearrange itself, and a sound like a tiny bell chimed inside his mind. He opened the book and found a map of a tiny house and a short, careful letter written for someone who would return. The letter's voice was tender and precise, telling him that sometimes people leave pieces of home along the paths to guide a lost child back. It spoke of safe rooms and of a mother who hummed recipes, and of a window that always opened to a sky with 2 moons. Aiden sat on the dusty floor for a long while, letting the letter sink in like water into clay. He felt like a traveler who had found a lighthouse after walking through fog for years. The pendant bit into his skin, and the small disc in his hand thrummed like a companion finally recognized. He did not find complete answers in that room. None of the big, obvious lines were suddenly drawn. But he found something more essential: the clear knowledge that people had waited for him and had loved him enough to make paths back. The feeling swelled into something quiet and strong, and for once, he could imagine a future in which the missing pieces would fit rather than fracture. He rose slowly, carrying the disc and the little book like lit lanterns. Through the dusty underpass, the air smelled of lemon and warm bread again, and he thought of the kitchen in a house he did not remember, of a chair that might have held his weight, of a small boy's laughter like the bell of a distant shop. He stepped into the evening with a new sort of readiness, the path before him lit not by certainty, but by the soft lamps of people who had cared enough to leave a trail. The 2 moons turned in their slow orbit, and the wind carried the same whisper he had heard since he first left the tent. "Come home when you are ready." Aiden walked on, not running, not frantic, but moving with the patient strength of someone who had collected not only objects, but the gentle companionship of a world that refused to let him vanish. He was no longer a boy without anchors. He was a keeper of small truths and a listener to long, soft echoes. The desert and the city and the stars had conspired together to bring him closer. And somewhere in the quiet topography of his chest, a light glowed steady and sure. The journey would continue, of course. There were more ruins, more voices, more fragments to gather. But for now, the feeling that he might one day stand on a porch, and know the smell of warm bread, without needing to guess, was enough to hold him. He closed his eyes briefly under the twin moons and let the night fold gentleness around him, ready to follow whatever thread the world offered next.